So I was stumbling around looking for some sort of changelog for Visual Studio Code's Copilot. I figured certainly I've missed some of the updates that have happened over the past, 2 years now that it's been out. So I figured I'd go find some list and work through it. And honestly, I didn't find a lot of changes. One thing I did stumble on, though, is this discussion here. And this is announcing Copilot Metrics API. That caught my attention because the first thing that came to my mind is what could you possibly be grabbing for metrics out of Copilot that would be so useful as to warrant this big long write-up here in terms of a discussion, as well as some people replying. And it turns out it's not actually just this post here. There's a link here, takes you out to a blog post that focuses just on this new metrics API. In fact, if you click on just Copilot here, you can see this is the most recent blog post. So certainly this has something interesting in it, right? Well, let's come back here and take a look at the discussion. All right, so this is a public beta of the metrics API available to business and enterprises starting today to supply you with information about Copilot's usage in your organization. So how people are actually using the Copilot extension. All right, so it's intended to be consumed and then combined with your own organization's data, I guess to produce some sort of report, to then produce visibility into how Copilot fits into the bigger picture of your software development lifecycle. If I come down below here to the documentation and resources, perhaps I can figure out a little bit more here. The very first link here is to the documentation for this API. If I open that up here, over on the left, we have an example of the enterprise's Copilot usage report or usage endpoint. And then here's an example response you might get back. Go through the information here. We have the day, the total suggestions count, the total acceptances count. So what that sounds like to me is you can get a report that will show you how many suggestions that Copilot made and then how many times they were accepted. What? Seriously? What could that possibly tell you about how you're using Copilot? Is a high acceptance rate going to be considered good? And that to me honestly reflects a feature that perhaps Microsoft cares about to understand how good Copilot is at making suggestions, more so than a company that's actually using Copilot would care about. After all, it's possible a low acceptance rate might be a good thing because it might mean you looked at a lot of examples before you pick something. Definitely going to be subjective. All right, so then we have the lines suggested. So I guess the number of lines of code suggested, and then the number of lines accepted. Why is lines of code something interesting to track at all? Furthermore, why would lines accepted be something interesting? I mean, if you really wanted to maybe look at the utility of the Copilot extension, you might find some way to produce a report that has lines of code accepted and lines of code that are still in the code base. In other words, lines of code that were accepted and then not later modified. All right, then we have the active number of users. Again, that looks like a metric that Microsoft cares about. The end users probably don't care about that much. Okay, and then we also have similar metrics for chat. So instead of just suggesting code inline, this would be the number of chats that have happened, I guess. Number of acceptances from a chat. And then chat underscore turns, I presume that is the number of chats that you've had. In other words, probably question and answer. And then again, a vanity metric here, active chat users. Again, sounds like something Microsoft's probably interested in, not so much your end users. So that's about it for overall. You do have some breakdowns here by IDE, for example, a VS Code versus a JetBrains IDE. Also get the language slice, if you will. So this is a subset of the suggestions as they pertain to people using the extension in a given IDE. And once again, overall, how is that going to give you any sort of information that's going to have any meaningful impact in the work that you do? So what? A lot of people use the extension inside of VS Code, and almost nobody uses it outside of VS Code. Now, maybe if I were being generous, I could imagine a world where the extension is broken in one of the IDEs. And if you're looking at this data, you'd be able to see that there's a problem and then go investigate it and get a root cause analysis and then fix it. And did you really need a metrics API to pull that off? So obviously, this is a very limited endpoint. Maybe in time, they'll add better metrics than just daily active users. But it's not just the API documentation that exists. There's also several other resources that were created. Gets even better here with a report, sample report that you can use. And if you scroll down here, I think this takes the cake here. We have an acceptance rate chart here that's basically showing you a plot of date and then the percentage accepted per date. Honestly, I have no idea what this plot might mean. And if I were to guess, the only thing I could probably ascertain about this is approximately where the weekends are, where the acceptance rate is lower. However, it could be a low number of users on the weekend. And so it could easily be somebody that has a high acceptance rate. And so there could be aberrations from the average. All right, so let's scroll down here. We also have a chart of the total suggestions, the green line here. And then we have purple for the acceptance. So you can see a ratio of how much was suggested versus how much was accepted. And so we're looking at what, 20% here, 25%. And of course, we have lines suggested. So the number of lines suggested versus the number of lines accepted. Again, what are you going to do with this information? Total active users? This is a chart for Microsoft's investors. This is not a chart for your company. And if I come back to the discussion, there's one more interesting resource, which is a learning pathway. So we have this big, long resource about measuring the impact of Copilot, supposedly. Again, using the metrics that exist right now, I don't really understand the relevance. Oh wait, we have some relevant metrics here. Satisfaction using Copilot. How exactly do you ascertain satisfaction from whether or not people clicked the yes button or the no button? And further confounding is that there are people out here that responded to this original post talking about how excited they are to use it, even trying to use the API and having some failures in doing so. Dear people, please don't take this the wrong way. It's just interesting to me that people respond so positively to something that has, well, at least as far as I'm concerned, about zero utility. But leave it to Microsoft.